know what I'm supposed to do in this video. I'm supposed to go, yes, Queen Theresa May, you really socked it to the government. Fair's fair. You know, may have my disagreements with you, but we need our allies on important matters. And whatever your past record happens to be, what matters is whether you're right or you're wrong. And Theresa May's right. So let's give her an applause. Bloody well done, Theresa May. I'm not going to do that at all, actually. In fact, I find this whole spectacle completely rehabilitating. I'm going to use this as a case study, actually, about the rehabilitation of monsters, generally by those who describe themselves as liberals. And it's about how, if you like, those who commit profound evils can evade responsibility. It allows those, it stops us from understanding how we ended up in the mess that we're currently in, which is a pretty big mess, all said and done. And it allows history to repeat itself and for us to descend even further into the disaster, the abyss that this country has sunk. And Theresa May is one of the chief architects of disaster and of just inhumanity and misery and pain and suffering. We're going to talk about that. So look, today the Tories passed the illegal migration bill. What this does is bar all refugees who arrive in small boats from claiming asylum, regardless of their circumstances. Their family could have been shot dead in front of them by the Taliban in Afghanistan, where Britain waged war for 2 decades and now just washed their hands of it. It could be from Iraq. They could be from Iraq, refugees, where a country our government actually helped to destroy, if we're going to just be completely honest about it. They could have been raped. They could have been tortured. It doesn't matter. They're getting deported. Now, this is all in the context of the Tories having clamped down on safe and legal routes. There are far fewer asylum seekers arriving in the UK than at the beginning of the century. There's just far more arriving on small boats because those safe and legal routes have been shut down, so there's no other way of people to enter the country in those circumstances generally, with exceptions made for, say, Ukraine, but not for, say, Sudan. Now, I support Ukrainian refugees being settled in this country. My own brother has taken in a Ukrainian refugee family. But what is the difference between a Sudanese refugee and a Ukrainian refugee in the eyes of the Tories? It's a real mystery. God only knows what they think the difference is between them. Now, Britain takes in far fewer refugees than, say, Germany or France. Those arriving here tend to speak English and or have connections, just as, for example, refugees from former French colonies are far more likely to settle in France, because your chances of a decent existence are far better in a country where you speak the language, obviously. So if you arrive in Europe and you're in France, you don't speak French, you do speak English, obviously you're going to want to come to Britain. That's why we are only taking in a tiny proportion of those taken in by rich countries, and an even tinier proportion of those taken in globally, because the vast majority are taken in by poorer countries who have the least means to support those refugees. Obviously, people would go, "Oh, why don't they apply? Why don't they arrive in the first safe country?" Which just generally means only Italy or France just Italy should take in refugees, or other countries, which where people arrive to begin with. In Europe, it's a complete ludicrous argument. Now, one of the things the bill does is remove protection against removal for suspected victims of modern slavery or human trafficking while their case is considered. There's an exception if someone is found to be cooperating with a police investigation, but the government have ensured it's not necessary for them to stay in the country unless judged to have compelling circumstances. That in practice makes any investigation a total farce. Let's just listen to Theresa May.
And then I saw Amendment 95, which, far from making the bill provisions better for the victims of modern slavery, makes it worse. And I believe that my right honourable friend was talking to me in good faith, but I have to say it's hard to see this Government Amendment 95 as an example of good faith. I would say rather it's a slap in the face of those of us who actually care about the victims of modern slavery and human trafficking.
Of course she's correct. Of course, sure, fine. You could argue, well, even Theresa May is criticising the Tories over this. That shows how awful they are. But while the calamity the Tories have inflicted on this country is truly a collective effort, they really have worked as a team, no single other politician has contributed more to the onslaught against migrants and refugees as Theresa May. She built her entire reputation on it. Her entire political career is built on a vicious campaign against migrants and refugees. As Home Secretary, she once claimed an illegal immigrant avoided deportation because of his pet cat. Absolutely false. Complete nonsense, a total lie. You know what? We rightly assail Boris Johnson for his demagoguery and his lies. But what about Theresa May? Why does she get away with it? Why does she get away with that kind of nonsense? Just feeding the lies, poisonous lies, in order to whip up prejudice against some of those desperate people on the face of the earth. Now, it was Theresa May who was the chief architect of the hostile environment. One of the many consequences of this terrible, terrible policy is that hundreds of Windrush Black Britons, were detained, denied their legal rights, and indeed deported from a country which had been their own for decades. She destroyed their lives. That's on Theresa May. Not just Theresa May. Again, it's a collective effort. And it is important that we don't just pick out bogeymen, bogey people, whatever. And we need to look at systems. We need to look at how this works collectively. I get all that. But it doesn't absolve individuals of their responsibilities and of their agency, and what she has done is obviously has had horrendous consequences. Now, under Theresa May's tenure as Home Secretary, LGBT refugees had to film themselves having sex with their partners in order to prove that they weren't straight. Just repulsive. She made inflammatory comments about millions of people in poorer countries wanting to come here, about immigration threatening the existence of a cohesive society, for putting pressure on our schools and hospitals, rather than, of course, Tory cuts, which decimated public services. Very easy, isn't it? Instead of saying, well, actually, the pressure on public services is to do with the massive, at the time, the biggest squeeze in NHS funding as a proportion of the economy since its founding. Let's just blame people from abroad who, without them, the entire NHS would collapse because we rely on foreign doctors and nurses. Or, for example, the slashing of per pupil funding. No, let's just blame people from abroad for Tory policies instead. She claimed they pushed down wages repeatedly when obviously smashed trade unions, real terms pay cuts introduced by the Tories for frontline workers, austerity and poor workers' rights are responsible. That's why we've had the longest squeeze in wages for working people since the Napoleonic era, not because of refugees and migrants, but because of government policies, which people like Theresa May deflected from and instead tried to get us to blame people from abroad, blaming things like the housing crisis on migrants when it's the Tories who flogged off council housing and didn't replace it, failed to build the housing the country needs, and failed to regulate a rip-off and unregulated private rented sector. We could go on. She did more than any other politician to fuel the anti-migrant, anti-refugee panic, and the current government have merely built on her work. Now, you get a bunch of Liberals who, I'm sorry to say, have the memories of like a week clapping her on good old Theresa May. She's decent in comparison to this lot, positively a statesperson. Rah, rah, rah. Honestly, I find it sickening. I just find it so nauseating. I can't help it. It really is just disgusting. These are people, clearly, for whom, I mean, they hate people like on the left who haven't actually done anything in power, and they will rant and rave about them and treat them as illegitimate, as interlopers, as extreme, as beyond the pale. But when it comes to people who, I don't know, whipped up massive vicious campaigns against some of the most vulnerable people on earth, destroyed lives, and probably drove significant numbers of people to premature deaths, absolutely not. They have no interest in holding those people to account, and they rehabilitate them. I mean, it's just... example, Tony Blair. Tony Blair, who's hated by most of the country. But again, Tony Blair, who literally killed hundreds of thousands of innocent people. Not just him, obviously, again, a collective effort. He teamed up with a hard-right administration, which I'll come on to, in the United States to invade Iraq, kill hundreds of thousands of people, amongst the British personnel, but obviously overwhelmingly Iraqis, whose lives are deemed to be not important, because when you bring up Iraq, Tony Blair's servile cheerleaders go, oh, God, about Iraq still, are you? Yes, actually, because hundreds of thousands of people died and continue to die as a direct consequence of that war. I doubt those people in 2 decades' time will go, if people bring up Putin's war in Ukraine, will go, oh, we're still going about Ukraine, are you? Yes, actually, because when people commit terrible crimes, you don't just go, well, they built Sure Start centres in Britain, so we can just forget about Iraq and the hundreds of thousands of people with brown skin who we do not regard as having equal weight in terms of human life to people in this country. George W. Bush, there's another one in America. Basically, a bunch of liberals have ended up rehabilitating him. Why? Because he's not as vulgar as Donald Trump. He may have invaded Iraq, set up Guantanamo, overseen mass torture, but hey, he doesn't like Donald Trump, and he doesn't do vulgar tweets, doesn't do crude, rude tweets. I mean, he gave a sweet once to Michelle Obama. It was so cute. Oh, bless him. This rehabilitation of monsters allows history to repeat itself over and over again. It constantly shifts the terms of political debate ever further into more obscene territory, because you end up with people who committed terrible, terrible crimes who are suddenly seen as not actually as bad in comparison to the next lot, rather than holding the people who laid the foundations for what comes next responsible to ensure that it doesn't happen again. That's what this is about. It's not about having a grudge or whatever. It's about responsibility. It's about holding people to account for what they do, rather than allowing them to whitewash their reputations for convenient political reasons. That's why I'm not going to clap on Theresa May like a seal. She's a disgrace. She's one of the, like George Osborne, again, keep seeing him on TV as though he's some sort of learned elder statesman, quoted by Keir Starmer approvingly denouncing economic policy under the Tories. No one has done more to destroy this country than George Osborne with his slash and burn austerity, which then fueled all the political turmoil that we've lived through. Why on earth are these people treated as anything other than pariahs, which is what would happen in a just world? These are monsters, and they should be treated as such, not as those who are all of a sudden, for opportunistic reasons, allowed to present themselves as rehabilitated, as those who are somehow have morality and principle in comparison to our current lot. Because they'll do the same thing with Rishi Sunak, I'm sure, in years to come, and with probably Suella Braverman, and that allows things to keep shifting ever further into even more obscene and morally depraved territory. Rant over, everyone. Please like and subscribe, and do support us on patreon.com/owenjones84. I'll see you in a bit.